Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in The Problem of God by Edgar Sheffield Brightman, published in 1930. We're going to take a look at pages 73 to 103. We're going to take a look at the idea of God as expanding, and this begins by taking a look at Block 1. And Brightman begins by looking at the historical development, which was threefold. The concept of God was initially tribal. God was bound up with interest of the tribe. Then it evolved into a concept that was national. A single deity was worshipped by a nation. Example, you got Israel and the God of Yahweh. And then universal phase was when relationships between nations arose. God is the one source of all being. So we went from tribal to national to universal concepts of the God idea. Now God as judge of creation, value became expanded as well. From preservation of life to vision of perfection, prophetic word did emerge, and eidos ideals emerged, all within the nation of Israel. And the idea of God expanded with regard to space. God was no longer a local deity. God transitioned from earth to the heavenly realm, to heaven. The idea of omnipresence evolved. Space exists inside God, not the other way around. God is thought of as immutable in purpose, and God's eidos ideals are unchangeable. That became the notion of the true. And then from there, the idea of God led to universality and the concept of omnipresence, and an eschatological point of view, or a developing teleology. The God idea took on the notion of omnipotence. God is posited as spiritual. The Gospel of John taught that God is spirit, and that means that God is conscious thought, conscious feeling, and conscious will. Values of personality emerged, and then God and event became linked together. God was perceived as present in every event. All of life exists within God. Therefore, the concept of the immanence of God emerged within Israel. The concept of the immanence of God. The God of Yahweh who dwells with his people. The immanence of God. So that gives us the look at the idea of God as expanding, but Brightman now wants us to consider the idea of God as contracting in Block 2. He takes up the notion of contracting. He begins with philosophical thought. In philosophy, the relation of God is emphasized. Relation of God passes through three stages. Theism said that God is creative spirit and the source of all existence. Pantheism said God is unity of creation. Everything created is within God. Immanence becomes the synthesis between theism and pantheism. They both agree that God is immanent in nature. But that leads to the note 2, moving from expansion to contraction. Because when we understand the immanence of God, then the theodicy question arises. Why is there evil? Why is there suffering? The notion of limitation emerged, or the notion of contraction, and a reevaluation of the God idea became mandatory. There had to be a revision of the idea of God. So in Note 3, Block 2, Note 3, immanence and limitation led to the need for a reevaluation of the idea of God. So re-examining God idea, expansion, led to concepts of omnipotence and omnipresence, but infinite expansion resulted in vagueness and that theodicy question, and that addressed the meaning of God. Also, there had to be a re-examination of the value of life, and value includes discrimination, selection, judgment, and eventual posited true ideals. For the Hebrew, value transitioned from protector of the Hebrew people to a father of all humanity. God was perceived as father of all humanity. Brightman says that then we came upon the re-examination of God as personality. And that means God as concrete conscious experience. Loyalty to the true is prioritized. The meaning of ideas actually imposes a limitation upon the idea of God. And Brightman says at this point the concept of the God of law emerged. The concept of God of law emerged, a God of moral laws. And so, expansion concerning the idea of God and contraction concerning the idea of God due to the theodicy question leads to the movement of God as a movement that includes suffering within God in Block 3. Now we look at the idea of God as suffering. Under God of law, God is only limited by his own principles. God is a God of principles. This contracts our concept of faith, protecting it from becoming excessive or neglectful. The unitary spirit of God is at peace within himself, but this same God is related to creation. Therefore, we have to reevaluate the concept of unity of God. How does a fallen creation become united with this unitary spirit of God? We have to redefine the concept of unity of God, reevaluate it. And that means, in Note 2, there must be a provision for suffering within the life of God. The doctrine of the Trinity was an attempt to address this issue. The Trinitarian God struggles for the world's salvation. So the notion of Trinitarian God emerged. Hegel's work of the negative within God also addressed this issue. Hegel said that opposition and struggle exist within the life of God. And Brightman, of course, agrees with Hegel here. So now we get the concept of God as suffering. God overcomes sin and brings good out of the struggle against sin. We must ask, how is the temporal related to the eternal? God's purpose is to develop a society of free, valued individuals. Above all else, our God idea must find God as faithful, must find God as trustworthy, says Brightman. In spite of the theodicy question, Brightman says that our idea of God must reach the notion of being trustworthy or recognizing faithfulness. So, in pages 73 to 103, we review the idea of God as expanding to the point of actually becoming a teleology, an understanding of the movement of God as a teleology. But then, Brightman says we necessarily move on to contraction because that teleology must address suffering. It must address evil. So now, limitation is talked about. How do we reconcile the theodicy problem? How do we solve the theodicy question? And Brightman says that the only way we can do that is to reevaluate the idea of God, to reevaluate the value of life, and to reevaluate God as personality. That's the only way we can resolve the theodicy question. If we do that, then God becomes a God of moral laws, which we discussed in our previous study. So even here back in 1930, he's already bringing up the notion of moral laws. The doctrine of moral laws that's in Brightman's case contributes to system. Remember our previous study on moral laws did really bring out the fact that moral laws contribute to system in Brightman's theology. There is a hierarchy of logic, laws, and then concepts. Remember, it was logic abbreviating laws and laws abbreviating concepts or principles. So even very early on, we learn that expansion of the idea of God leads to teleology. Contraction of the idea of God leads to the God of moral laws. And how does Brightman put that together? As the movement of God, as a personality, of a personhood who is a God who suffers. All of creation is inside God, and God is struggling to overcome suffering and overcome evil. Therefore, God is a suffering God, a God who takes up the suffering of his creation. And Brightman says that our idea of God eventually simply must arrive at a notion of God being trustworthy and faithful, trustworthy and faithful. And that way we can resolve the theodicy question. We can unite expansion of teleology and contraction to the restraint of moral laws to a synthesis of a God who suffers with us and struggles with us against evil to bring about kingdom. So this lesson gives us a great look at expansion, contraction, and suffering with regard to the idea of God. That's your recall triad. The idea of God is expanding, contracting, and suffering. The idea of God is expanding and contracting and suffering as teleology, moral laws, and trustworthy struggle. And that's going to wrap up pages 73 to 103, and we will pick up next time on page 104.